The glass slipped from Clara Bennett's hand and shattered against the marble floor, before she even realized her fingers had gone numb. Every head near the west entrance of the ballroom turned toward the sound, and for one long second, she stood frozen in her simple blue dress, certain that 200 wealthy strangers were staring at her. Nobody was supposed to notice her tonight. She was staff. She was the woman who checked the seating charts and told the string quartet when to start playing. Not a guest. Not someone meant to be seen. Yet somehow, in the middle of the busiest gala of the year, the wrong person had noticed her, and he would not stop. Ethan Carter had been standing near the champagne tower for 11 minutes without saying a single word to anyone, which for him was practically a personal record. Women in sequined gowns had approached him twice already, each one laughing a little too loudly at things he had not said were funny, each one angling her body just so, hoping he would ask for a private tour of the garden terrace. He had learned to nod at the right moments and let his eyes drift over their shoulders while they spoke. It was not arrogance, not exactly. It was exhaustion. He had attended so many of these events that the entire evening felt scripted, every conversation a rehearsal for one he had already survived 100 times before. Then the glass broke. He turned his head out of simple reflex, the way anyone does when something shatters in a quiet room, and what he saw stopped the words in his throat. A woman in a blue dress was kneeling to gather the broken pieces with her bare hands, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, her dark hair falling loose from its pins. She was not glamorous in the practiced way the other women in the room were glamorous. She looked like she had been running all night, because she had been, and she was the only person in the entire ballroom who had not looked at him even once. That, more than anything, was what caught him. Clara scooped the last shard of glass into a napkin and stood quickly, aware that a young waiter had rushed over to help and that her supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Vane, was already making her way across the floor, with a look that promised a conversation Clara did not want to have. She apologized twice, thanked the waiter, and turned to leave the area entirely, hoping to disappear into the kitchen corridor before anyone important decided her clumsiness was worth remembering. She did not get far. "Are you all right?" The voice came from directly behind her, low and unfamiliar, carrying the particular calm of someone who was never in a hurry, because the world had always waited for him. Clara turned, expecting another guest asking where the restroom was, and instead found herself looking up into the face of Ethan Carter, whose photograph she had seen exactly once, tucked into the corner of a business magazine left behind in the staff lounge. She recognized him instantly. Everyone in the events industry knew that face, that name, the quiet fortune behind it. "I'm fine," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Thank you. I should get back to work." She expected him to nod and move on, the way important men usually did, once the obligatory kindness had been performed. Instead, he studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable, as though trying to place her in a memory that did not exist yet. "You cut your hand," he said. Clara looked down and saw the thin line of red across her palm, so faint she had not even felt it. "It's nothing. It's still bleeding. I'll deal with it after the event. There's a first aid kit behind the bar. I saw it when I walked in." He said this simply, without any performance in his voice, as though pointing out something as ordinary as the weather. Clara blinked at him, thrown off by the fact that a man worth more money than she would earn in several lifetimes had apparently noticed the location of a first aid kit at a party he supposedly did not want to attend.
"I appreciate it," she said carefully, "but I really do need to get back to my work."
She walked away before he could respond, weaving through the crowd with the practiced speed of someone who had spent years learning how to move invisibly, through rooms full of people who mattered more than she did. She did not look back. She had no reason to. Men like Ethan Carter said polite things to service staff at every event. It meant nothing, cost them nothing, and she had learned better than to read anything into a stranger's momentary kindness. But Ethan stood exactly where she had left him, watching the space where she had disappeared into the crowd, and felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. It was not attraction, not in the simple sense. He had felt attraction plenty of times, and it always arrived loud and immediate, the way a room grew warmer when a beautiful woman entered it. This was quieter. This was the strange, unsettling discomfort of being ignored by someone who had every reason to want his attention, and somehow choosing not to want it at all. Ethan. His cousin Nathan Hale appeared at his elbow, drink in hand, grinning in the easy way he always did when he sensed a story developing. You've been standing here staring at nothing for 5 minutes. Everything all right? Who was that woman? The one in blue. Nathan followed his gaze toward the retreating crowd, but Clara was already gone, swallowed by the moving mass of silk and tuxedos. Which one? Half this room is wearing blue. She works here. Event staff, I think. Dark hair. Cut her hand on some broken glass. Nathan raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying this more than he should have. You're asking about a staff member? You, who once told me you'd rather discuss quarterly earnings than talk to anyone at these things. I'm not asking for a reason, Ethan said, though even as the words left his mouth, he understood they were not entirely true. I'm just curious. Curious, Nathan repeated, drawing the word out, like he did not believe it for a second. All right, I'll ask around. Though I doubt you'll get much. These events companies rotate their staff constantly. She's probably freelance. Ethan said nothing else, but his eyes kept drifting toward the far side of the ballroom for the rest of the night, searching for a flash of blue fabric among the endless rotation of gowns. He caught sight of her twice more, both times from a distance, both times moving quickly, with a clipboard tucked against her side, directing waiters or checking something off a list. She never looked toward him, not once. And that, more than anything any of the other women in the room had done to try to earn his attention, kept his focus locked entirely on her. By the time the gala reached its final hour, the crowd had thinned considerably, the older guests retreating home, while the younger ones lingered near the bar for one more drink, before the night ended completely. Ethan found himself near the terrace doors, half listening to a business associate discuss an upcoming merger, when he spotted her again. This time she was alone, standing near the edge of the room, with a clipboard pressed against her chest, watching the last of the caterers pack away silver trays. She looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with boredom. She looked like someone who had been working since early morning, and still had hours left before she could rest. He excused himself from the conversation, and crossed the room, before he had fully decided to do it. You're still here, he said. Clara startled slightly, then recovered her composure with the ease of someone accustomed to hiding fatigue in front of clients. Someone has to make sure the room gets cleaned up properly. Even after the event ends? Especially after the event ends. That's usually when things go wrong. Silverware disappears. Chairs get left in the wrong storage room. Someone always forgets to pack the linens correctly, and then I get a call at 7 in the morning asking why the tablecloths smell like champagne. Despite herself, Ethan felt the corner of his mouth lift. It was the first genuine smile he had allowed himself all evening. That sounds exhausting. It is, but it pays the bills. She glanced at him properly, for the first time since their earlier exchange, taking in the expensive cut of his jacket, the quiet confidence in his posture, and felt a familiar wariness rise in her chest. She had met men like him before, men who found the idea of an ordinary working woman novel simply because she did not fall over herself trying to impress them. That novelty always faded quickly, once the initial curiosity wore off, and she had learned not to let it mean anything when it happened. I don't think I caught your name, Ethan said. Clara. Clara, he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. I'm Ethan Carter, she finished for him. I know who you are. Half the room has been watching you all night. Not you, though. The observation hung in the air between them, more honest than either of them had intended. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure whether it came from embarrassment or something closer to being caught. I was working, she said simply. I don't have time to watch anyone. That's the most refreshing thing anyone has said to me all night. I'm sure plenty of people say refreshing things to you. Not like that. Most people either want something from me or want me to notice that they're not trying to get anything, which is its own kind of trying. He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away and yet kept her rooted in place. You didn't do either. Clara considered him for a long moment, weighing the strange sincerity in his voice against everything she had learned about men in his position over the years. I really should finish my work, she said finally, though there was less conviction in it than before. Of course. He stepped back, giving her room to pass, though his eyes never left her face. It was good to meet you, Clara. You too, Mr. Carter. Ethan, he corrected softly. She allowed herself a small nod, something between agreement and dismissal, and walked away toward the catering staff gathering near the kitchen doors. She did not look back this time either, though it took considerably more effort than it had the first time. Ethan remained near the terrace doors long after she had gone, watching the empty space where she had stood, turning the entire strange encounter over in his mind. He had spent years cultivating the ability to read people quickly, to understand within moments of meeting someone exactly what they wanted from him and how much effort it would take to give them just enough to send them away satisfied. She had not flattered him, had not lingered, had not asked a single question about his business, or his family, or the size of his estate outside the city. She had simply told him the truth about broken glass and packed linens, and somehow that honesty had unsettled him more than an entire evening of practiced charm from other women ever could. Nathan found him there 20 minutes later, still staring at nothing, and laughed outright when he realized his cousin had not moved from the spot. "You've got it bad," he said. "I don't even know her last name." "Then find out. You're Ethan Carter." Finding out a stranger's last name should not be difficult for you. Ethan did not answer, but the thought had already taken root, quiet and persistent, refusing to loosen its grip even as the last guests filed out into the cold night air, and the ballroom lights began dimming behind them. He thought about her the entire drive home, replaying the brief moments of their conversation, searching for some detail he might have missed, some clue about who she was beyond the blue dress and the tired eyes, and the honesty that had cut through every practiced defense he carried into rooms like that one. He did not know it yet, but he would spend the following days trying to track down a woman whose full name he did not have, whose phone number he did not have, whose only connection to him was a shattered glass and a single unguarded conversation near a terrace door. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment she shared with her sister, Clara Bennett lay awake far longer than she intended, wondering why she could not stop thinking about the man who had noticed her hands were bleeding before she had noticed it herself. Neither of them said it aloud, not even to themselves, but something had shifted that night, small and quiet and impossible to undo, the way the first crack in glass spread slowly until the whole thing gives way at once. The gala had ended. Whatever this was had only just begun. 3 days after the gala, Ethan Carter sat in his office on the 40th floor of a glass tower overlooking the river, staring at a spreadsheet he was supposed to be reviewing, and thinking instead about a woman whose last name he did not know. His assistant, a sharp young man named Simon Cole, had noticed the distraction almost immediately, though he had wisely chosen not to comment on it until Ethan asked him directly to pull up the contact information for the event planning company that had organized the charity gala. "The Whitmore Foundation Gala?" Simon asked, already typing. "I can get you the company name, but why do you need it? The event's over." "I need to speak with someone who worked it, a coordinator." "Do you have a name?" "Clara." "That's all I have." Simon paused his typing and looked up, one eyebrow raised in a way that reminded Ethan uncomfortably of his cousin Nathan. "Clara who?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking you to find out." "Right." Simon returned to his screen, though the corner of his mouth twitched, with barely suppressed amusement. "Any other details? Height, approximate age, distinguishing features?" "She had dark hair, blue dress. She was carrying a clipboard most of the night. So was half the staff." Ethan exhaled slowly, frustrated with himself for how little concrete information he actually possessed. He had spent 3 days turning the encounter over in his mind, and somehow he had emerged from it with almost nothing useful. He knew the sound of her voice when she spoke about broken glass and packed linens. He knew the particular way she had looked at him, without any of the calculation he had grown used to seeing in other women's eyes. But he did not know her last name, her phone number, or even which company had actually employed her that night. "Find the event company," he said finally. "I'll take it from there." Simon found the company within the hour. It was called Lang Events, a mid-sized firm that handled galas and private functions throughout the city, run by a woman named Olivia Grant, who had built a reputation over the past decade for flawless execution and absolute discretion. Ethan called the office directly that afternoon, introducing himself and requesting a meeting to discuss booking the company for an upcoming event, though the excuse felt thin even as he offered it. He had no upcoming event that required their services. He simply wanted an excuse to walk through their offices and see if he might recognize a face among the staff. Olivia Grant herself answered his call, her voice warm and professional, in the particular way of someone who had learned to sound delighted, regardless of how she actually felt. "Mr. Carter, of course. We would be thrilled to work with you. What sort of event did you have in mind?" "Something smaller than the Whitmore Gala," he said, improvising quickly. "A private dinner, perhaps. I'd like to meet with the team who worked that event, actually, if that's possible." I was impressed by the execution. There was a brief pause on the line, and Ethan wondered if he had said something wrong, revealed too much interest too quickly. But when Olivia spoke again, her tone remained unchanged. "Of course. I can arrange for you to meet our lead coordinators. We have a wonderful team." "Was there a woman named Clara working that night? Dark hair? I believe she was handling the seating arrangements." Another pause, longer this time. "Clara Bennett," Olivia said slowly. "Yes, she was there. She's one of our best, though she's usually behind the scenes rather than meeting with clients directly." Clara Bennett. Ethan repeated the name silently to himself, feeling an unreasonable satisfaction settle over him, now that the missing piece had finally fallen into place. "I'd like her involved in the planning, if that's possible. She has a good eye for detail." "I can certainly ask her," Olivia said, though something in her voice suggested hesitation. "Clara tends to prefer working behind the scenes. She's not usually comfortable with direct client interaction." "I understand. I'll leave that decision to her then." He ended the call feeling a strange mixture of triumph and uncertainty. He had a name now, a full name, something solid to hold on to after 3 days of half-formed memories and unanswered questions. But he also understood, somewhere beneath the satisfaction, that pursuing this further would require a delicacy he was not entirely used to exercising. Clara had not asked to be found. She had made her disinterest clear enough at the gala, walking away from him twice without hesitation. Whatever this strange pull was that kept drawing his thoughts back to her, he could not simply summon her into a meeting and expect her to feel the same curiosity he felt. Across the city, in the modest offices of Lang Events, Clara Bennett sat at her desk, reviewing invoices, when Olivia Grant appeared in her doorway, with an expression Clara had learned to recognize as trouble. "Ethan Carter called," Olivia said without preamble. "He wants to book us for a private event, and he specifically asked for you to be involved in the planning." Clara's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. "Me? Why would he ask for me?" "He said you handled the seating arrangements well at the gala." Apparently he was impressed. Olivia's tone carried a note of curiosity she did not bother to hide. "You didn't mention you'd spoken with him directly." "It wasn't anything significant. I broke a glass. He asked if I was all right. That's the entire conversation." That's an unusually detailed thing for a busy client to remember 3 days later. Clara set down her pen and pressed her fingers against her temples, feeling the familiar ache of a headache building behind her eyes. She had spent the past 3 nights telling herself that the conversation at the gala meant nothing, that men in Ethan Carter's position said polite things to service staff constantly, and forgot about them within hours. She had almost convinced herself of it too, until this exact moment, when the evidence suggested otherwise. "I don't want to be involved," she said finally. "Give the account to Grace. She handles client meetings better than I do anyway." "He specifically asked for you, Clara." "Then tell him I'm not available." Olivia studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that suggested she understood far more about the situation than Clara had told her. "You know I have to think about the business here. Ethan Carter is not the kind of client we turn away without good reason. If he's requesting you specifically, and you refuse without explanation, that could raise questions I'd rather not answer. Tell him I'm busy with other accounts." "Are you?" Clara hesitated, unable to produce a convincing lie fast enough, and Olivia sighed with the patient exasperation of someone who had managed difficult employees for years. "Look, I'm not asking you to fall in love with the man. I'm asking you to take one meeting. If it goes badly, if he makes you uncomfortable in any way, we'll hand the account to someone else immediately. But I can't justify losing a client of his caliber because you're avoiding a conversation." The reasoning was sound, and Clara knew it, even as every instinct in her body urged her to refuse. She thought about her rent, due in 11 days, and the growing pile of bills on her kitchen counter that her sister's part-time income alone could not cover. She thought about the tired satisfaction of building something stable after years of unstable jobs, and unreliable men, and how foolish it would be to jeopardize that stability over one uncomfortable conversation. "Fine," she said finally. "One meeting." Olivia's relief was immediate and visible. "Thank you. I'll set it up for next week." The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, at a small conference room in Lang Events's offices, chosen deliberately by Clara to keep the encounter professional and brief. She arrived early, dressed in a simple gray blazer, her hair pulled back neatly, determined to present herself as nothing more than a competent event coordinator, with no personal history worth mentioning. She reviewed her notes twice, rehearsing polite, businesslike responses to whatever questions he might ask, preparing herself to remain entirely unaffected by whatever charm he intended to deploy. None of it prepared her for the moment he actually walked through the door. Ethan arrived precisely on time, dressed more casually than she had seen him at the gala, in a simple dark sweater that somehow made him look less like a wealthy stranger and more like an ordinary man who happened to carry himself with unusual confidence. He greeted Olivia warmly, shook hands with the two other coordinators present, and then turned to Clara with an expression that held none of the practiced charm she had expected. "Clara," he said simply, "thank you for making time for this." "Of course," she replied, matching his tone with careful neutrality. "Olivia mentioned you're interested in booking a private event." "I am." He took the seat across from her, and for the next 40 minutes, the conversation proceeded exactly as any professional meeting should. He described a dinner he wanted to host for a small group of business associates, asked reasonable questions about venue options and catering styles, and made no attempt whatsoever to steer the conversation toward anything personal. Clara found herself relaxing slightly as the meeting progressed, reassured that perhaps she had misread the entire situation, that his interest truly had been nothing more than professional appreciation for competent work. It was only at the very end of the meeting, as the other coordinators gathered their notes and began filing out of the room, that Ethan lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Your hand," he said quietly, once they were alone. "It healed all right?" Clara glanced down at her palm, where only the faintest trace of a mark remained from the broken glass. "Completely. Thank you for asking. I looked for you again that night, after our conversation near the terrace. You'd already left. I had another event to prepare for the following morning. I couldn't stay late." "I understand." He studied her for a moment, something thoughtful in his expression. "I want to be honest with you, Clara, since you were honest with me at the gala. I don't actually need to host a private dinner. I requested this meeting because I wanted to see you again, and I didn't know a more reasonable way to arrange that." The confession hung in the air between them, startling in its directness. Clara felt her carefully constructed composure waver, though she forced herself to hold his gaze steadily. "That's a significant amount of trouble to go through for one conversation. I'm aware it sounds strange. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing men in your position do when they're bored and looking for something new to entertain themselves." The words came out sharper than she intended, years of accumulated caution rising to the surface before she could stop them. "I appreciate the honesty, but I'm not interested in being anyone's temporary curiosity." Something flickered across Ethan's face, surprise perhaps, or the sting of being misjudged, though he did not raise his voice or argue the point. "That's fair," he said quietly. "I understand why you'd think that. I would probably think the same thing, in your position." His willingness to accept her suspicion without defending himself caught her off guard, more than any argument could have. She had expected wounded pride, perhaps insistence that she was wrong about his intentions. Instead, he simply nodded, gathered his coat, and prepared to leave without any further attempt to convince her otherwise. "For what it's worth," he added, pausing at the door, "I don't do this. I've never once arranged a fake business meeting to see someone again. I don't entirely understand why I did it this time either." He left before she could respond, and Clara sat alone in the empty conference room for several minutes afterward, replaying his words, trying and failing to reconcile the wariness she had built over years of disappointment with the strange, persistent feeling that this particular man might actually be telling her the truth. She did not know, sitting there in the quiet office, that this would be far from the last time their paths crossed, nor did she know how much more complicated things would become before either of them found any real clarity about what they meant to each other. Grace Ellery had been Clara's roommate for nearly 4 years, ever since they had met working the same catering job during their first year out of college, and in that time, she had developed an almost uncanny ability to read Clara's moods before Clara herself fully understood them. So when Clara came home from the meeting at Lang Events and immediately began scrubbing the kitchen counters with far more energy than the task required, Grace knew something had happened. "You only clean like that when you're upset, or when you're trying not to think about something," Grace said, leaning against the doorway with a mug of tea in her hands. "Which one is it tonight?" "Neither," Clara said, scrubbing harder. "Clara, it's nothing important." Grace waited, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch until Clara finally set down the sponge and sighed, defeated by her roommate's patient stubbornness. She explained the entire situation in halting sentences: the gala, the broken glass, the strange, persistent attention from a man whose face appeared occasionally in business magazines, the fabricated meeting that had turned into an unexpected confession. Grace listened without interrupting, and when Clara finished, she took a long sip of her tea before responding. "So he made up an entire fake business meeting just to see you again, and then told you the truth about it instead of letting you find out on your own? That's the part that's bothering me. It would be easier if he'd just kept pretending. Because then you could dismiss him as another rich man playing games." "Exactly. But he didn't give you that easy exit." Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling the weight of the past few days settle heavily across her shoulders. "I've done this before, Grace. I fell for someone who seemed different, who said all the right things. And it turned out he was exactly like every other man who thought my life was some kind of interesting diversion from his own. I can't do that again. I don't have the energy for it. And honestly, I don't have the time. My rent is due in a week, and I still owe the printer company for the invitations from the spring gala." "I know." Grace's voice softened, understanding without judgment. "But this isn't the same situation as Victor, and you know it." The mention of the name sent a familiar chill through Clara's chest. Victor Lang had been her boyfriend for nearly 2 years, a man from considerable wealth who had courted her with expensive dinners and grand gestures, only to eventually reveal that his interest had largely stemmed from the novelty of dating someone outside his social circle. He had introduced her to his friends as though she were an exhibit, had made subtle comments about her clothing and her manner of speaking that she had initially mistaken for playful teasing, and had ultimately ended things the moment a woman from his own world re-entered his life. The wound from that relationship had healed slowly, and Clara had spent the 2 years since building careful walls around herself, refusing to let anyone from that world close enough to hurt her again. "How do I know it's different?" Clara asked quietly. "How do I know he's not just another version of the same thing?" "You don't," Grace admitted. "Not yet. But you also don't know that he is. Maybe give yourself permission to actually find out, instead of deciding in advance." Clara did not respond immediately, turning the advice over in her mind as she finished cleaning the already spotless counter. The conversation lingered with her long after Grace had gone to bed, keeping her awake far later than she intended, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, and wondering whether her caution was protecting her from genuine danger, or simply preventing her from ever allowing herself to be happy again. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan sat in his study, reviewing the same conversation from his own perspective, replaying Clara's sharp words about temporary curiosities, and men in his position, feeling the sting of them settle uncomfortably in his chest. He understood her wariness, even respected it, but understanding did not make the rejection any easier to accept. His cousin Nathan arrived unannounced that evening, letting himself into the study with the easy familiarity of someone who had known Ethan since childhood and had long ago stopped waiting for formal invitations. He dropped into the leather chair across from Ethan's desk and studied his cousin's distracted expression with open curiosity. "You look terrible," Nathan observed. "Did the meeting with the event coordinator go badly?" "How did you know about the meeting?" "Olivia Grant mentioned it to my business partner, who mentioned it to me, because apparently everyone in this city talks too much." Nathan smiled, though it faded when he registered the seriousness on Ethan's face. "What happened?" Ethan recounted the conversation briefly, including Clara's accusation that he was simply a bored man looking for temporary entertainment. Nathan listened, nodding occasionally, and when Ethan finished, he leaned forward with unexpected seriousness. "She's not entirely wrong to be cautious, you know," Nathan said. "Think about how this looks from her side. A man with your kind of money and status shows sudden intense interest in a woman working an event, someone with none of the social standing that usually surrounds you. It's not unreasonable for her to assume you're not being serious. I am being serious. I believe you. But belief isn't proof, and she has no reason yet to trust that you're any different from whatever experience taught her to be this careful. Nathan paused, considering his next words carefully. Do you know anything about her history? Why she reacted so strongly? No, she didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Maybe you should find out gently, rather than pushing forward with more grand gestures. Sometimes the answer isn't proving yourself louder. Sometimes it's just giving someone time and space to see you clearly, without any pressure attached. Ethan considered this advice for a long moment, recognizing the wisdom in it even as impatience gnawed at him. He was not accustomed to waiting for things he wanted, had rarely encountered obstacles that persistence and resources could not eventually overcome. But something about Clara's situation felt different, more delicate, requiring a patience he was not entirely certain he possessed. I won't contact her again, he said finally, the decision costing him more than he expected it to. If she wants nothing further to do with this, I'll respect that. Nathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden resolve. That doesn't sound like you. Maybe it's time it did. Over the following days, Ethan kept his word, resisting the urge to call Lang events under any pretense, resisting the temptation to have Simon quietly investigate Clara's background further. He threw himself into his work instead, attending meetings, reviewing contracts, filling his schedule with enough obligations to keep his mind occupied during daylight hours. It was only in the quiet moments, late at night, when the office had emptied and the city outside his window had settled into its rhythm of distant lights and slow traffic, that his thoughts inevitably drifted back to her. Clara, for her part, found herself equally distracted, though she refused to admit it even to Grace. She threw herself into work with the same determined focus, coordinating 3 separate events over the following 2 weeks, staying late to perfect seating arrangements and confirm vendor deliveries, filling every available hour with tasks that left no room for wandering thoughts. But she noticed, with growing frustration, how often her mind returned to that conference room conversation, to the surprising honesty in Ethan's confession, to the way he had accepted her harsh words without argument or wounded pride. It was nearly 3 weeks after their meeting, when circumstances forced them back into each other's path, though neither of them had engineered the encounter. Olivia Grant called an all-staff meeting one Thursday morning to announce that Lang Events had secured a significant new contract, a series of quarterly events for a prominent business consortium that would require careful coordination over the following year. As she outlined the details, Clara felt a growing sense of dread settle over her, confirmed moments later when Olivia mentioned the name of the consortium's primary contact. Ethan Carter will be our main point of contact for this account, Olivia said, glancing briefly at Clara before continuing. Given the scope of this contract, I'll need my most experienced coordinators involved, which means Clara and Daniel Pierce will be leading the planning team. Clara's stomach tightened at the mention of her name, and she felt several of her colleagues' eyes flicker toward her with quiet curiosity, aware that something unspoken had passed between her and the wealthy client in recent weeks, though the specifics remained unknown to most of them. She wanted to protest, to insist that someone else take the lead on this account, but she understood the impossibility of that request. Refusing a career-defining contract because of personal discomfort would raise far too many questions, and more practically, she needed the additional income this contract would provide. After the meeting ended, Olivia approached her privately, her expression sympathetic but firm. I know this puts you in an awkward position, given what happened at your last meeting with him, but I genuinely believe you're the best coordinator for this contract, and I don't want to lose it because of a personal matter that has nothing to do with your professional capabilities. I understand, Clara said, forcing steadiness into her voice. I can handle it professionally. I trust you can. And if things become uncomfortable at any point, tell me immediately, and we'll adjust the arrangement. Clara nodded, though privately she wondered how she was supposed to maintain professional distance from a man whose confessions still echoed uncomfortably in her memory, whose brief absence over the past 3 weeks had left her far more unsettled than she wanted to acknowledge. She had told herself repeatedly that his silence proved her suspicions correct, that he had simply lost interest once she refused to make things easy for him. But some quieter part of her mind, one she refused to examine too closely, had felt something closer to disappointment at his absence, rather than relief. The first official planning meeting for the new contract was scheduled for the following week, and as the date approached, Clara found herself preparing for it with a thoroughness that went beyond her usual professional diligence, rehearsing calm, businesslike responses, reminding herself repeatedly that whatever had passed between them in that conference room 3 weeks earlier had no bearing on the work ahead of her now. She did not yet know that Ethan had spent those same 3 weeks fighting his own battle against the urge to reach out, honoring a promise to himself that he would not push further unless she gave him some indication she wanted him to. Nor did she know that when he learned Lang Events had assigned her to lead his new contract, his relief had been so immediate and so overwhelming that he had needed several minutes alone in his office simply to steady himself before his next meeting. Fate, it seemed, had decided the two of them were not finished with each other yet, regardless of how carefully either of them tried to keep their distance. The conference room at Lang Events felt smaller than Clara remembered when she walked in for the first official planning meeting of the new contract, though she suspected the sensation had less to do with the actual dimensions of the room and more to do with her own nervous awareness of who was sitting across the table. Ethan arrived precisely on time, as he always seemed to, accompanied by 2 of his own staff members who immediately began discussing logistics with Daniel Pierce, leaving Clara and Ethan to review the master calendar together at the far end of the table. For the first hour, everything proceeded with careful professionalism. Clara walked him through the proposed schedule for the quarterly events, outlining venue options and preliminary budgets, and Ethan asked thoughtful questions that revealed genuine attention to detail rather than the distracted interest she had half expected. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing, referencing them later in the conversation in ways that suggested he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak.
"You mentioned the autumn event should avoid conflicting with major industry conferences," he said, nearly 40 minutes into the discussion.
Have you checked the dates against the Meridian Summit? I believe that falls in the same window. Clara glanced up from her notes, surprised. I was going to bring that up next. Most clients don't think about scheduling conflicts that far outside their own industry. I like to understand the full landscape before committing to dates. It saves everyone trouble later. That's unusually thorough. I've learned that thoroughness early prevents chaos later. Most problems in business come from people assuming details will sort themselves out. He said this with a small, self-deprecating smile. I learned that lesson the hard way, more than once. Clara found herself relaxing slightly, despite her earlier resolve to maintain strict professional distance. There was something disarming about watching a man of his wealth and standing admit to past mistakes so easily, without any of the defensive posturing she had come to expect from men who rarely faced consequences for their errors. By the time the meeting reached its natural conclusion, nearly 2 hours after it began, she realized with some discomfort that she had genuinely enjoyed the conversation, that the guarded wariness she had carried into the room had softened considerably without her fully noticing. As the other staff members gathered their materials and filed out, Ethan lingered near the doorway, the same way he had at their previous meeting, though this time his expression carried less uncertainty. Thank you for a productive meeting, he said. That's my job. It is. But I also wanted to say, I've kept my distance these past few weeks because you asked me to, and I meant to respect that. I still do. I just want you to know, I haven't stopped thinking the things I said in our last meeting were true. I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. I just didn't want my silence to be mistaken for indifference. Clara felt something tighten in her chest, an uncomfortable mixture of guardedness and something warmer she refused to name. I appreciate the honesty, she said carefully. But we do have a professional relationship now, given the contract. It would be easier for both of us if we kept things that way. I understand. He nodded, accepting her boundary without argument, though something in his eyes suggested the acceptance cost him more than he let on. Professional it is. Over the following weeks, their working relationship settled into a rhythm that was, on the surface, entirely professional. They met regularly to finalize details for the first of the quarterly events, exchanged emails about vendor contracts and guest lists, and maintained the careful distance Clara had requested. But professional distance, Clara discovered, did little to prevent the small moments of genuine connection that crept into their interactions despite her best efforts. There was the afternoon, when a catering company canceled unexpectedly 3 days before an event, throwing the entire schedule into chaos, and Ethan spent 2 hours on the phone alongside her, using his own connections to secure a last-minute replacement, rather than simply expressing sympathy from a distance. There was the evening when she mentioned offhand that she had skipped lunch because of a scheduling crisis, and he appeared 20 minutes later with a simple sandwich from the cafe down the street, setting it on her desk without comment, before returning to his own work, as though the gesture required no acknowledgement. "He's not subtle," Grace observed one evening, after Clara recounted the sandwich incident with more enthusiasm than she had intended to reveal. "Bringing you lunch isn't exactly a neutral professional gesture. It's just kindness. People bring each other lunch all the time." "Clara." "What?" "You've mentioned 3 separate things he's done for you in the past 2 weeks, completely unprompted, with a level of detail that suggests you've thought about each one considerably more than you're admitting." Clara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing the futility of denying what Grace had already observed clearly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," she admitted quietly. "I told him to keep things professional, and he has, technically. But everything he does makes it harder to remember why I wanted that distance in the first place. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Or maybe it's exactly the kind of thing that gets me hurt again." Grace set down the book she had been pretending to read and looked at her roommate with genuine concern. "Clara, I love you, and I understand why Victor left you so cautious. But you can't spend the rest of your life measuring every kind man against the worst one you ever knew. At some point, you have to decide whether you're going to let fear make all your decisions for you." The words settled uncomfortably in Clara's chest, following her into the following days, as she continued working alongside Ethan on the growing list of events for the consortium contract. She found herself watching him more carefully during their meetings, searching for the calculation and self-interest she had come to expect from wealthy men, and finding, with increasing frustration, only genuine attentiveness and consistent kindness that showed no signs of wavering or hidden agenda. The turning point came nearly 6 weeks into the contract, during preparations for the consortium's first major quarterly event, when a serious problem threatened to derail the entire evening less than 4 hours before the guests were scheduled to arrive. The call came in at exactly 2 in the afternoon, and Clara felt her stomach drop the moment she recognized the venue coordinator's number flashing on her phone. She answered immediately, already reaching for her jacket, already anticipating bad news before the woman on the other end spoke a single word. "Clara, we have a problem. There's been a water leak in the main ballroom ceiling. Maintenance says it happened sometime overnight, and the carpet and part of the flooring near the stage area are completely soaked. We can't seat 200 guests in there tonight." Clara's mind raced through the implications immediately. The consortium's first quarterly event was scheduled to begin in less than 5 hours, with guests traveling from 3 different cities specifically for the occasion, caterers already preparing food for the agreed menu, and a string quartet booked to perform in a room that was now, apparently, unusable. "Is there any other space in the building we could use?" she asked, already moving toward the door of her small office, phone pressed against her ear. "There's a smaller room on the 2nd floor, but it only holds about 80 people comfortably. Nowhere near enough for your guest list." "What about the outdoor terrace?" "It's raining. Has been since this morning." Clara closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself to think clearly, despite the mounting panic building in her chest. This was precisely the kind of catastrophe that could damage Lang Events' reputation permanently if handled poorly, especially with a client of Ethan's standing, watching the disaster unfold in real time. "Give me 20 minutes, I'll call you back." She dialed Daniel Pierce first, who confirmed grimly that no other venue in the city could accommodate 200 guests on such short notice, not with proper catering setup and appropriate staging. Every reasonable option had already been booked months in advance for other events happening that same evening. By the time she finished the call, Clara felt something close to despair settling over her, the weight of an impossible problem pressing down, with no clear solution in sight. She called Ethan next, though every instinct told her this conversation would be the most difficult one of the entire crisis. She had promised him a flawless event, had assured his consortium partners that Lang Events could handle any challenge professionally, and now she had to explain that the entire evening might need to be cancelled entirely. He answered on the second ring. "Clara, is everything all right?" "There's been a serious problem with the venue," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice as she explained the water damage, the impossible timeline, the lack of alternative spaces large enough to accommodate the guest list. She expected anger, or at minimum frustration, the kind of controlled disappointment that wealthy clients typically expressed when their expectations were not met. Instead, after a brief pause, Ethan spoke with calm, measured focus. "Okay, let's think through this together. What about my family's property outside the city? The main hall there holds well over 200 people, and it's fully furnished for entertaining." Clara blinked, caught off guard by the offer. "That's incredibly generous, but it's nearly 40 minutes outside the city. Guests are expecting a downtown venue. I can send a message to the guest list immediately explaining the change and providing transportation details. Most of them are already familiar with the property, actually. My family has hosted events there before." He paused, and she could hear the sound of him already moving, papers shuffling, a door opening somewhere in the background. "I'll head there now and start coordinating with the household staff to prepare the space. Can you redirect the caterers and the quartet?" "Yes. I can have everyone redirected within the hour if the venue is confirmed." "Consider it confirmed. I'll call you the moment I arrive." The next 4 hours passed in a blur of frantic coordination, phone calls, and rapid decision-making that left Clara breathless, but strangely exhilarated by the time she arrived at Ethan's family property, just after 5 in the evening. The main hall, when she walked into it, exceeded every expectation she had allowed herself to hold. An elegant space with high windows and warm wooden floors that somehow felt more intimate and welcoming than the sterile ballroom they had originally booked. Ethan met her at the entrance, sleeves rolled up, directing household staff as they arranged additional seating and adjusted lighting fixtures throughout the room. He looked nothing like the composed, carefully dressed man she had grown accustomed to seeing in conference rooms. He looked, in that moment, genuinely engaged, working alongside his staff, rather than simply directing them from a distance. "This is incredible," Clara said, turning slowly to take in the full scope of the room. "I can't thank you enough for offering this. You would have found another solution eventually. I just happened to have one available faster. Not every client would offer their family home on 4 hours' notice. Not every coordinator would work this hard to save an event that isn't technically her responsibility to save single-handedly." He said this quietly, watching her with an expression that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You could have called me hours ago and told me the event was cancelled. Instead, you spent the entire afternoon finding solutions. That's my job. It's more than your job, Clara. I've watched you work these past 6 weeks. You care about getting things right in a way that goes beyond professional obligation." He hesitated, then continued more quietly. "I understand why you wanted distance between us. But I think you should know, the more I've watched you handle situations like this one, the more certain I've become that what I feel isn't some passing curiosity. It's something I haven't felt before, honestly." Clara opened her mouth to offer the same careful deflection she had used in their previous conversations, some reminder about professional boundaries or the impracticality of the situation. But standing in the middle of a room they had rescued together through hours of frantic teamwork, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what they could accomplish when they worked side by side, she found the familiar words would not come. "I'm scared," she admitted instead, the honesty surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Not of you exactly. Of what happened the last time I let myself trust someone from your world. It didn't end well, and I'm not sure I have the strength to survive that kind of disappointment again." Something in Ethan's expression softened further, all traces of his usual composed confidence giving way to something more vulnerable. "I can't promise you I'll never make mistakes, Clara. But I can promise you, I'm not playing some kind of game with your feelings. I don't know how to prove that to you, except by continuing to show up, consistently, for as long as it takes for you to believe it." The sound of arriving vehicles outside interrupted whatever might have followed, the first guests beginning to make their way up the long drive toward the house, and Clara stepped back reflexively, aware of the work still ahead of them that evening. But something had shifted in that brief exchange. some barrier that had held firm through weeks of careful professional distance finally beginning to crack under the accumulated weight of consistent kindness and genuine partnership. The event itself proceeded beautifully, guests marveling at the elegant, unexpected venue, the quartet filling the high-ceilinged hall with warm music, the catering staff adapting seamlessly to the new kitchen arrangements. Clara moved through the evening with the practiced efficiency of her profession, but she found herself aware of Ethan throughout the night in a way she had not permitted herself before, catching his eye across the room during quiet moments, feeling something warm settle in her chest each time he offered a small, private smile meant only for her. By the time the last guest departed and the household staff began the process of returning the hall to its usual quiet elegance, Clara felt exhausted in the particular way that came from surviving genuine crisis, but also lighter than she had felt in longer than she cared to admit. Ethan found her near the entrance as she prepared to leave, offering to have his driver take her home, rather than allowing her to call for transportation herself. She accepted, and the drive back into the city passed in comfortable, companionable quiet, neither of them forcing conversation, both content simply to exist in the same space, after the exhausting intensity of the day. When the car finally stopped outside her apartment building, Ethan walked her to the door himself, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "Thank you for today," she said softly, "for everything. Thank you for trusting me enough to call, instead of trying to handle an impossible crisis entirely alone." Clara studied his face for a long moment, weighing years of accumulated caution against the persistent, undeniable warmth that had grown steadily between them over the past 6 weeks. "I don't know what I'm ready for yet," she admitted finally, "but I don't want you to stop showing up either." It was not a declaration of certainty, not the kind of dramatic confession that resolved every doubt in an instant. But it was, for the first time since that broken glass at the charity gala, an honest acknowledgement that whatever existed between them deserved the chance to grow into something real, regardless of how frightening that possibility felt to either of them. Ethan smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that made her chest ache with unfamiliar hope. "Then I won't stop," he said simply, and left her standing at her door, watching his car disappear into the quiet city night, feeling for the first time in years that perhaps her carefully constructed walls had been protecting her from more than just disappointment. In the weeks that followed the crisis at the family estate, something between Clara and Ethan shifted into an easier rhythm, one that no longer required the careful pretense of purely professional distance. They still worked together on the consortium contract, still met regularly to plan upcoming events, but the conversations now stretched beyond venue logistics and catering budgets into longer discussions that had nothing to do with work at all. She learned that he had grown up in a household where affection was rarely spoken aloud, where his father measured success purely in terms of business achievements, and his mother, Margaret Vane, had spent decades cultivating the family's social standing with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Ethan had spent his entire childhood learning which words earned approval and which earned disappointed silence, and by the time he reached adulthood, he had become fluent in the particular language of charm and composure that the world expected from someone in his position, even as it left him feeling perpetually disconnected from anything resembling genuine connection. "I used to think that was just how everyone lived," he told her one evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at a small restaurant far from the usual venues frequented by his social circle. "It wasn't until I got older that I realized most people actually talk to their families about things that matter." "That sounds lonely," Clara said. It was, still is, sometimes. He turned his glass slowly between his fingers, considering his next words carefully. "That night at the gala, when I first saw you, I think part of what drew me in was how unguarded you seemed. You weren't performing for anyone. I'd forgotten what that looked like." Clara, in turn, found herself sharing pieces of her own history she had kept carefully guarded for years, including the slow, painful unraveling of her relationship with Victor Lang, a man who had once seemed to offer exactly the kind of stability and warmth she had craved, only to reveal that his interest in her had always carried an undertone of novelty rather than genuine respect. She described the humiliation of overhearing him describe her to his friends as refreshingly simple, the quiet devastation of realizing that 2 years of what she believed was love had actually been little more than an extended amusement for a man who eventually returned to someone from his own world without a second thought. I promised myself I wouldn't let that happen again, she admitted. That I wouldn't let myself become someone's temporary escape from boredom. I understand why you'd be careful, Ethan said. I just hope you know, the more time I spend with you, the more certain I become that this isn't temporary for me. It hasn't felt temporary since that first night. Their relationship deepened steadily over the following month, built not on grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but on the accumulated weight of small, consistent moments. Ethan learned her habits, the way she always ordered tea instead of coffee in the afternoons, the particular stress she carried in her shoulders before a major event, the quiet satisfaction that lit her expression whenever a difficult evening concluded successfully. Clara, in turn, learned to recognize the difference between Ethan's public composure and his private honesty, the way his guard genuinely lowered when they were alone together, revealing a warmth and vulnerability that few people in his life ever witnessed. Grace noticed the change immediately, commenting one evening that Clara had started humming while she cooked dinner, something she had not done in the 2 years since her relationship with Victor ended. I like this version of you, Grace said simply, the one who isn't constantly braced for disappointment. I'm still braced, Clara admitted. Just a little less than before. That's progress. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed within Ethan's own social circle either, though the reactions there proved considerably less warm than Grace's quiet approval. Nathan, always supportive, teased his cousin gently about the transformation, noting that Ethan had begun leaving business dinners earlier than usual and had turned down several social invitations he would previously have attended out of obligation. But other members of the family, particularly Ethan's mother, viewed the developing relationship with growing concern that she made little effort to hide. Margaret Vane had spent decades carefully curating her son's public image, arranging introductions to appropriate young women from established families, cultivating alliances through social connections that she believed would eventually secure the family's position for another generation. The idea that Ethan had grown genuinely attached to an event coordinator, however competent and kind she might be, represented precisely the kind of unpredictable variable Margaret had spent her entire adult life working to eliminate from her family's carefully constructed world. I heard you've been spending considerable time with the woman coordinating the consortium events, Margaret said during a family dinner one evening, her tone carrying the deceptively pleasant edge that Ethan had learned since childhood to recognize as genuine displeasure. Clara, I believe her name is. That's right, Ethan said carefully, aware that whatever conversation followed would require considerable diplomacy. She seems perfectly capable at her job, from what I understand. But surely you recognize that a passing attraction to someone outside our circle is quite different from a serious consideration for the future. I'm not sure I follow the distinction you're drawing, Mother. Margaret's expression tightened slightly, though she maintained her composed tone. I simply mean that the Whitmore family has expressed considerable interest in strengthening ties between our families, and Eleanor Whitmore would be an excellent match, both socially and practically. I would hate to see you complicate that possibility over what may well be a temporary fascination. It isn't temporary. Ethan, his mother's voice carried a warning now, thin beneath its polished surface. I understand the appeal of novelty, but novelty fades, and when it does, you'll be left having damaged important relationships for the sake of a distraction that never had any real future to begin with. Ethan felt old, familiar frustration rise in his chest, the same suffocating pressure he had spent his entire life navigating carefully, weighing every word against the expectations of a family that measured worth almost entirely in terms of strategic advantage. But something had changed since that night at the gala, some quiet resolve that had grown steadily alongside his feelings for Clara, and for the first time, he found himself unwilling to simply defer to his mother's careful calculations. I care about her, Mother. That isn't going to change because it's inconvenient for the family's social plans. Margaret studied him for a long, silent moment, her expression unreadable in the particular way that had always unsettled Ethan as a child. We'll see, she said finally, her tone suggesting the conversation was far from concluded. I do hope, for your sake, that your judgment proves better than your father's did at your age. The comment landed with deliberate precision, referencing a story from decades earlier that Ethan had only ever heard in fragments, something about his father's own youthful romance with someone outside their social circle, a relationship that had apparently ended badly enough that its lessons had shaped Margaret's entire approach to guiding her son's choices ever since. He did not ask for details that evening, though the comment lingered with him uncomfortably. A quiet warning he chose, for the moment, to set aside. He did not yet know that his mother's disapproval would prove to be only the beginning of the challenges ahead, nor did he anticipate how quickly those challenges would arrive, or how close they would come to unraveling everything he and Clara had carefully built together over the preceding months. The invitation arrived at Lang Events on a Wednesday morning, addressed specifically to Clara, requesting her presence at a private lunch to discuss what the accompanying note described only as an important matter concerning the Whitmore Foundation's upcoming charity initiatives. Clara did not immediately recognize the sender's name, Eleanor Whitmore, though something about the formal, deliberate wording of the invitation left her with an uneasy feeling she could not quite explain. She arrived at the restaurant precisely on time, dressed in her most professional attire, expecting a conversation about event planning or perhaps a potential new contract with the Whitmore Foundation. Instead, she found a woman, perhaps a few years older than herself, elegantly dressed, seated at a corner table with the composed confidence of someone entirely accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. "Clara, thank you for coming," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her. "I hope you don't mind the somewhat unusual nature of this invitation. I felt it was important that we speak directly, woman to woman, rather than allowing this situation to continue developing without clarity." "I'm not sure I understand what situation you're referring to," Clara said carefully, settling into her seat with growing wariness. "Ethan, of course." Eleanor's smile remained pleasant, though something calculating flickered behind her eyes. "Our families have known each other for years. I've known Ethan since we were children, and our mothers have long hoped that we might eventually formalize what has always been, quite frankly, an expected arrangement between our families." Clara felt her stomach tighten, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm afraid Ethan hasn't mentioned any arrangement like that to me. He wouldn't have, would he? Men rarely discuss the practical realities of their family obligations with someone they're simply enjoying themselves with in the meantime." Eleanor's tone remained light, almost sympathetic, which somehow made the words land with greater cruelty than open hostility would have. "I don't say this to hurt you, Clara. I genuinely don't. But I think you deserve honesty, and I'm not certain anyone else in Ethan's circle will offer you that." "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "There was talk, a few months ago, at one of the club gatherings, that Ethan had made something of a wager with several of his associates, about how long it would take him to win over someone entirely outside his usual world. A coordinator, specifically. Someone who worked events for wealthy clients, but had none of that wealth herself. I didn't think much of it at the time, honestly. Men say foolish things when they've had too much to drink. But then I heard your name mentioned in connection with him, and I felt I owed it to you to say something, before things progressed any further." Clara sat in stunned silence, the accusation settling over her like ice water, freezing every warm memory of the past few months into something suddenly suspect and cold. She thought of the sandwich Ethan had brought her during a busy afternoon, the family estate he had offered without hesitation during the venue crisis, the quiet vulnerability in his voice when he described his lonely childhood. Had all of it been calculated, performed for the sake of winning some cruel wager among his wealthy friends? "I don't believe that," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the doubt already creeping into her certainty. "I understand the impulse to defend him. I felt the same impulse once, honestly, before I learned better. But ask yourself, Clara, has he ever introduced you to his family properly? Has he ever spoken publicly about his intentions toward you, in any way that would suggest permanence rather than passing entertainment?" Eleanor's expression softened into something that might have been genuine sympathy, though Clara could not be certain anymore what was genuine and what was calculated. "I've heard his mother has already expressed her disapproval quite clearly. If his feelings were as serious as he's apparently told you, don't you think he would have defended you more forcefully by now, rather than allowing the situation to continue unresolved?" The observation struck a nerve Clara had not realized was still exposed, memories of Ethan's careful vagueness about his mother's reaction to their relationship rising uncomfortably to the surface. He had mentioned the conversation only briefly, had assured her it was nothing to worry about, But he had never actually described what his mother had said, nor had he made any public gesture that suggested he intended their relationship to progress beyond its current careful privacy. "I appreciate you telling me this," Clara said finally, gathering her composure with considerable effort. "But I think I need to hear whatever the truth is, directly from Ethan, rather than secondhand. Of course, I only hope, whatever you learn, that you'll forgive me for caring enough to say something." Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand briefly, a gesture that felt simultaneously comforting and unsettling. "I know how these men operate, Clara. I grew up among them. I would hate to see someone genuinely kind get hurt because she trusted appearances over reality." Clara left the restaurant in a daze, Eleanor's words circling relentlessly through her mind as she walked back toward her office, unable to shake the growing suspicion that everything she had believed about the past few months might have been built on an elaborate deception. She thought about calling Ethan immediately, demanding an explanation, but some instinct told her to wait, to observe him carefully before confronting him directly, to see whether his behavior over the following days confirmed or contradicted Eleanor's devastating claims. That evening, Ethan called, as he usually did, his voice warm and familiar through the phone, completely unaware of the doubt now growing steadily in Clara's chest. She kept the conversation brief, offering vague excuses about exhaustion from a long day, and hung up feeling more uncertain than she had felt since the earliest days of their acquaintance, when she had first learned to distrust the easy charm of wealthy men who seemed too good to be genuinely interested in someone like her. Grace noticed the change immediately when Clara returned home, her expression tight and distant in a way that had not appeared in weeks. "What happened?" Grace asked, setting aside the magazine she had been reading. Clara recounted the entire lunch conversation, watching Grace's expression shift from concern to visible skepticism as the story unfolded. "And you believed her? Just like that?" Grace asked, when Clara finished. "I don't know what to believe. She seemed so certain, so sympathetic. Why would she make something like that up? Maybe because she's the woman his family wants him to marry, and you're the obstacle standing in her way?" Grace's tone carried unusual sharpness, frustrated by what she perceived as an obvious manipulation. "Clara, think about this logically. This woman has every reason to want you gone from Ethan's life, and she chose to deliver this devastating accusation over a private lunch rather than letting you hear the truth directly from Ethan himself. Doesn't that seem at least a little suspicious to you? But what if she's telling the truth? Then ask him directly. Give him the chance to defend himself before you decide he's guilty, based entirely on the word of a woman who benefits enormously from you believing the worst about him." The advice was sound, and some rational part of Clara's mind recognized its wisdom, even as the wound Eleanor had opened continued to throb painfully beneath the surface. But years of accumulated caution, sharpened by the devastating memory of Victor's betrayal, made it far easier to believe the worst than to trust the fragile hope she had allowed herself to build over the preceding months. She spent that night lying awake, replaying every kind gesture Ethan had offered her, searching desperately for evidence that would either confirm or dispel the poisonous doubt now settled permanently in her chest, uncertain which outcome she feared more. Clara began pulling away the very next morning, though she did it carefully, quietly, in ways she hoped would not immediately alert Ethan to the shift taking place inside her. She kept their scheduled planning meeting brief, focused entirely on logistics for the upcoming quarterly event, and declined his invitation to dinner afterward with a vague excuse about needing to catch up on paperwork. Ethan noticed immediately, of course, the sudden coolness in her voice, the careful distance she maintained, even while standing in the same room with him, the absence of the easy warmth that had characterized their interactions for months. He said nothing that first day, assuming perhaps she was simply tired or preoccupied with work. But by the third consecutive day of the same careful distance, concern had hardened into something closer to alarm. "Clara," he said, catching her after a meeting had concluded, and the other staff members had filed out of the room. "Is something wrong? You've seemed different this week." "I've just been busy," she said, gathering her papers without meeting his eyes. "The consortium contract requires a lot of attention right now." "That's not it, and we both know it." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "Please, talk to me. Whatever's happened, I'd rather know than watch you pull away without understanding why." Clara hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect herself by maintaining careful distance and a competing desire to simply ask him directly about Eleanor's claims and end the uncertainty that had tormented her for days. Finally, exhaustion won out over caution. I had lunch with Eleanor Whitmore last week. Something shifted immediately in Ethan's expression, wariness replacing his earlier concern. What did she say to you? She told me about a wager. Something about you and your friends making a bet regarding how long it would take you to win over someone completely outside your social circle. She said everyone at some club gathering had heard about it, that you'd chosen me specifically because I fit whatever criteria the bet required. Clara's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. She also mentioned that your families have long expected you and she would eventually marry, and that your mother has already made her disapproval of our relationship quite clear. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, a wave of frustration and something close to weary recognition passing across his features. There is no wager, Clara. I have never made a bet with anyone about you, or about winning over any woman outside my social circle. I don't know where Eleanor heard such a thing, though I have suspicions about why she chose to tell you that particular story. Why would she make something like that up? Because our families have discussed the possibility of a match between us for years, exactly as she described, and because she has made her own interest in pursuing that match known to my mother on more than one occasion, despite the fact that I have never encouraged it. Ethan's jaw tightened as he spoke, frustration evident beneath his controlled tone. My mother has not been quiet about her disapproval of our relationship, Clara. That part, unfortunately, is true. But there is no wager. I would never treat you, or anyone, as the subject of some cruel game among wealthy friends. How am I supposed to know that for certain? Clara's voice cracked slightly, months of careful hope colliding painfully with the raw fear that had haunted her since Victor's betrayal. You never told me your mother disapproved this seriously. You never mentioned Eleanor's expectations at all. I only learned about any of it from a stranger at a lunch I didn't even want to attend. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you with family politics that have nothing to do with what exists between us. I was trying to protect what we have, not hide anything from you. He reached toward her, then stopped himself, sensing the careful distance she still maintained. Clara, please. I understand why you'd be frightened after everything you told me about Victor, but I am not him. I have never once treated our relationship as anything less than serious. Then why haven't you told your family that clearly? Why haven't you introduced me properly, if this is as real to you as you claim? The question landed with uncomfortable precision, and Ethan hesitated a moment too long before responding, the pause itself confirming something Clara had already begun to suspect. I was building toward that, he said finally. I wanted to give things time to develop naturally before forcing a confrontation with my mother that I knew would be difficult. So you were protecting yourself from that confrontation, more than protecting me. That's not fair. Isn't it? Clara felt tears gathering, furious with herself for allowing this much vulnerability to show, even as the words continued pouring out of her. I've spent months convincing myself that this was different, that you were different, and now I find out that your own family has been actively opposing this the entire time, that there's an expectation you're supposed to marry someone else, and that I only learned any of this because your family's chosen candidate decided to warn me directly. How am I supposed to trust that what we have is real, when you've kept every difficult truth carefully hidden from me? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, recognizing that no immediate defense would undo the damage already done, no matter how sincerely he offered it. You're right that I should have told you about my mother's reaction sooner, he said quietly. I'm sorry for that. But please believe me when I say, there is no wager, Clara. Whatever else Eleanor told you, that part is a deliberate lie, meant to hurt you and push you away from me. I need time, Clara said finally, stepping back from him entirely, putting physical distance between them that matched the emotional distance already opening in her chest. I can't think clearly right now, not with everything spinning through my mind at once. Clara, please, Ethan, I need time. He let her go, though every instinct screamed against it, watching her walk out of the conference room with the same careful, composed steps she had used the very first night they met, when she had walked away from him without a single backward glance. The difference this time was that he understood exactly what he stood to lose, and the knowledge settled over him like a physical weight. heavier than anything his family's disapproval had ever managed to impose. He confronted Eleanor the following morning, arriving unannounced at her family's townhouse, with barely controlled fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. She received him in the sitting room, her expression carefully arranged into polite surprise, though something in her eyes suggested she had anticipated this visit. "Ethan, what a surprise. Is something wrong? You told Clara there was a wager, that I made some kind of bet with my friends about winning her over." His voice remained low, controlled, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "There is no wager, Eleanor, and you know that perfectly well. Why would you tell her something so deliberately cruel?" Eleanor's composure flickered, just briefly, before settling back into place. "I only told her what I'd heard, Ethan. If it isn't true, I apologize for any confusion I caused. You didn't hear anything. You invented an entire story designed to frighten a woman who has already survived one devastating betrayal, purely because you wanted her out of my life, so you could pursue whatever arrangement our mothers have been discussing behind my back. Is it so wrong that I hoped you might eventually see reason?" Eleanor's mask finally cracked, genuine frustration bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "Our families have expected this match for years, Ethan. You know that. And instead you've thrown yourself into some infatuation with an event coordinator who has nothing to offer this family beyond whatever charm has apparently blinded you to reality. She has more integrity than anyone I've met in this entire social circle, including you." Ethan's voice remained quiet, though the words carried unmistakable finality. "I want you to contact her directly and correct the lie you told, today. And if I refuse, then I'll make certain everyone in our circle understands exactly what kind of manipulation you're capable of, and I doubt that reputation will serve your family's interests nearly as well as you imagine." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression that held none of his usual careful diplomacy. "I loved my quiet, private life before all of this began, Eleanor, but I have never once felt as certain about anything as I feel about Clara. Whatever you and my mother had planned for me, it was never going to happen, regardless of what you told her. All you've accomplished is causing genuine pain to someone who deserved far better than your cruelty." He left without waiting for her response, already dialing Clara's number as he walked toward his car, desperate to reach her before the doubt Eleanor had planted had time to grow into something permanent and unshakable. But Clara did not answer, and the call went to voicemail, leaving Ethan standing alone on the quiet street outside Eleanor's townhouse, uncertain whether he had already lost something he was only now beginning to fully understand the value of. 3 days passed without a single word between them, the longest silence they had endured since the night of the broken glass at the charity gala. Clara buried herself in work, taking on extra tasks at Lang events to keep her mind occupied, though Grace noticed she had stopped humming while she cooked dinner, and the light that had crept back into her expression over the preceding months had dimmed considerably. "You should call him," Grace said on the third evening, watching Clara push food around her plate without actually eating any of it, or at least listen to whatever he has to say.
I don't know what there's left to say.
"Maybe nothing, or maybe everything, but you won't know until you give him the chance." Clara did not respond, though the words lingered with her long after Grace had gone to bed, following her into another sleepless night spent replaying every moment of the past several months, searching for certainty in memories that now felt colored by doubt. Meanwhile, Ethan spent those same 3 days in a state of quiet, determined resolve, understanding clearly that words alone would not undo the damage Eleanor's lie had caused, nor would they address the legitimate hurt Clara felt at having been kept in the dark about his mother's disapproval. If he wanted to prove that his feelings were genuine, he needed to demonstrate it through action, not simply through further explanation. He requested a private meeting with his mother on the 4th day, arriving at the family estate with a clarity of purpose he had rarely felt in any previous conversation with her. Margaret received him in her study, her expression carefully neutral, though something in her posture suggested she anticipated the confrontation ahead. "I understand Eleanor spoke with your event coordinator recently," Margaret said before Ethan could begin. "I heard the conversation did not go particularly well for anyone involved. Eleanor lied to Clara, mother. She told her I'd made some kind of wager about winning her over. That lie has caused genuine harm to someone who deserves better." "I wasn't aware of the specific lie," Margaret said, though her tone lacked genuine surprise. but I won't pretend I haven't hoped you would eventually reconsider your current attachment in favor of a more suitable arrangement. That's precisely what I want to discuss. Ethan remained standing, unwilling to settle into the familiar dynamic of deferential conversation that had characterized nearly every interaction with his mother throughout his life. I love Clara, Mother. Not as a passing distraction, not as some temporary rebellion against family expectations, but as someone I intend to build a genuine future with, regardless of whether that future includes your approval. Margaret's expression tightened, though she said nothing immediately, allowing the silence to stretch between them with practiced patience. I understand this isn't what you envisioned for me, Ethan continued. I understand the family has certain expectations about alliances and social positioning that Clara doesn't fit into neatly, but I'm not willing to sacrifice genuine happiness for the sake of maintaining appearances that have never once made me feel anything close to fulfilled. You speak as though happiness and responsibility exist in opposition, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the weary edge of someone repeating an argument she had made countless times before. They don't have to, Ethan. Your father and I built a successful life together, despite marrying primarily for strategic reasons rather than passionate love. Affection can grow from practical foundations. It doesn't require this kind of dramatic upheaval. Is that truly the life you want for me? A marriage built on strategy rather than genuine connection? Ethan studied his mother carefully, searching for some crack in her composed exterior. You once mentioned father had his own experience with someone outside our circle, when he was young. What happened to that relationship exactly? Something flickered across Margaret's face, old pain surfacing briefly before she suppressed it beneath her usual careful control. Your father loved someone before he met me. Someone from a considerably more modest background. His parents made it clear the relationship would never receive their support, and eventually, he accepted their judgment and moved forward with a more suitable match. Was he happy with that choice? Margaret hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ethan found the answer he had suspected all along. He built a good life, she said finally, though the words carried less conviction than her usual pronouncements. We built a good life together. But he wasn't happy, not completely, not the way he might have been, if he'd been allowed to choose for himself. Ethan softened his tone slightly, recognizing the vulnerability beneath his mother's carefully maintained composure. I don't want that kind of life, Mother. I don't want to spend the next 40 years wondering what might have been, simply because I was too afraid to choose genuine happiness when it was standing right in front of me. The study fell silent for a long moment, Margaret studying her son, with an expression Ethan had rarely seen from her, something closer to genuine consideration than practiced calculation. You're certain about this, she said finally. It was not quite a question. Completely certain. And if I continue to withhold my approval, then I hope, eventually, you'll come to see what I already know. But either way, my decision remains the same. Ethan met his mother's gaze steadily, unwilling to back down from the resolve that had solidified over the preceding difficult days. I would rather have your blessing, Mother, but I won't require it to build the life I actually want. Margaret said nothing further that day, though something in her expression suggested the conversation had shifted, something long settled within her, a crack forming in decades of careful certainty about how her son's life should unfold. Ethan left the estate without any promise of reconciliation, but with a clarity of purpose that had eluded him for most of his adult life, understanding finally that some things mattered more than his family's careful calculations. His next stop was Eleanor's townhouse once more, though this visit required considerably less confrontation than the first. He found her waiting, apparently anticipating his return, her earlier composure replaced by something closer to genuine discomfort. I already called her, Eleanor said before he could speak. Clara, I told her the truth, that there was no wager, that I invented the story, because I resented watching you choose someone else over the arrangement our families had discussed for years. I'm not proud of what I did, Ethan. I hope, in time, she'll believe me. Something eased slightly in Ethan's chest at this unexpected admission, though it did not erase the days of damage already done. Thank you for correcting it, he said simply. I hope you understand why I can't forgive the pain you caused her easily, regardless of your reasons. I understand, Eleanor said quietly. I hope you'll both find whatever happiness you're looking for, even if it wasn't the future I imagined for either of us. Ethan left her townhouse and drove directly toward Clara's apartment, though he had no way of knowing whether Eleanor's correction had reached her yet, or whether the damage of the preceding days had already hardened into something beyond repair. He arrived to find her building quiet, evening settling over the street in soft, fading light, and stood outside her door for a long moment, gathering the resolve to knock, uncertain what reception awaited him on the other side. Clara had already received Eleanor's call 20 minutes before Ethan arrived, sitting alone in her small apartment, with her phone still clutched in her hand, trying to process the unexpected confession that had come through the line. Eleanor's voice had carried genuine remorse, an admission that the wager story had been entirely fabricated, born from jealousy and years of quiet resentment, rather than any actual truth about Ethan's intentions. Clara had listened in stunned silence, torn between overwhelming relief and lingering hurt at how easily she had allowed the lie to take root in the first place. She was still sitting with those tangled emotions when a knock sounded at her door, and she opened it to find Ethan standing in the hallway, his usual composed confidence replaced by something more raw and uncertain than she had ever seen from him before. "Eleanor called me," she said, before he could speak. "She told me everything, that there was no wager, that she made it up." "I know. I confronted her this morning, and again this evening. I wanted to be the one to tell you myself, but it seems she got there first." He studied her carefully, searching her expression for some indication of where they stood. "Clara, I need you to understand something. Whatever hurt I caused by keeping my mother's disapproval from you, it was never because I doubted my feelings for you. It was because I was afraid of exactly this, of losing you, before I'd had the chance to prove how serious I actually am." "You went to your mother," Clara said quietly. It was not quite a question, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "I did. I told her clearly that I intend to build a future with you, with or without her approval. I'm done letting other people's expectations dictate the most important decisions of my life." He stepped closer, though he stopped short of touching her, giving her space to close the remaining distance herself, if she chose to. "I know these past few days have been difficult, and I know I have work to do, to earn back your trust after everything that happened. But I wanted you to know, I'm not backing down from this. From us." Clara studied him for a long moment, weighing every accumulated fear against the steady, undeniable evidence of his consistent devotion over the preceding months. The family estate offered without hesitation, the quiet vulnerability shared over countless dinners, and now this, a willingness to confront his own mother, rather than allow doubt to end what they had built together. "I'm sorry I doubted you so quickly," she said finally. "I should have come to you directly, instead of letting Eleanor's words take root before I gave you the chance to explain. You've survived real betrayal before, Clara. It makes sense that you'd be cautious when someone handed you a story that confirmed your worst fears." Ethan reached for her hand then, gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not. "I don't expect you to trust perfectly overnight. I just want the chance to keep earning it, for as long as it takes." Clara felt the last of her carefully maintained walls finally give way, months of accumulated caution dissolving beneath the weight of everything he had shown her, not through grand romantic speeches, but through consistent, quiet actions that had never once wavered, even under genuine pressure. "I don't want to keep being afraid," she said softly. "I'm tired of measuring everything against what happened before." "Then don't. Measure it against what's actually in front of you instead." She allowed herself to lean into him then, and he wrapped his arms around her carefully, as though she were something precious he had nearly lost through carelessness he intended never to repeat. They stood together in the quiet hallway for a long while, neither of them speaking, simply allowing the relief of reconciliation to settle over them after days of painful uncertainty. The following months brought steady, quiet progress in their relationship, built now on a foundation considerably more honest than before. Ethan introduced Clara properly to his extended family at a small gathering, and though Margaret's approval remained noticeably reserved, she offered nothing resembling open hostility either, seeming to accept, with the same careful pragmatism she applied to every aspect of her life, that her son's decision had already been made and would not be reversed through further resistance. Nathan, delighted by the entire development, made no effort to hide his satisfaction at having predicted, months earlier, exactly where this unlikely romance would eventually lead. Clara's professional life flourished alongside her personal happiness, the consortium contract expanding steadily, as Lang Events built an increasingly strong reputation for handling even the most complicated events, with grace and creativity. Olivia Grant, initially cautious about the personal complications surrounding the account, eventually admitted that Clara's growing relationship with Ethan had, if anything, strengthened rather than compromised her professional judgment. Her genuine investment in his satisfaction, translating into consistently exceptional work. Nearly a year after that first fateful gala, the Whitmore Foundation held its annual charity event once more, in the same grand ballroom where Clara had first dropped a glass of champagne and caught the attention of a man she had barely noticed at all. This time, however, Clara did not attend as staff, moving invisibly through the crowd with a clipboard pressed against her chest. She arrived as a guest, dressed in an elegant gown of deep green, her hair styled carefully, standing beside Ethan as his acknowledged partner for the evening. The room buzzed with the same energy it always carried, wealthy guests circulating in expensive attire, string music filling the air beneath glittering chandeliers. But this time, when Ethan scanned the crowd, he did not do so with the detached boredom that had characterized his presence at every previous gala throughout his life. He already knew exactly who mattered in that room, and she stood beside him, her hand resting comfortably in his. Across the room, Clara caught sight of Grace and Daniel Pierce, both invited as guests, now given their close involvement in Lang Events' continued partnership with the consortium, laughing together near the terrace doors, in a manner that suggested their own budding friendship might eventually deepen into something more. Clara smiled at the sight, remembering with fondness how much had changed since that first anxious night, when she had walked away from a wealthy stranger, without a single backward glance, certain that whatever brief attention he'd shown her meant nothing lasting. "Do you remember this room?" Ethan asked quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him over the surrounding music. "Every detail," Clara said. "I broke a glass right over there, and a very persistent man wouldn't stop asking if I was all right. I believe he was rather taken with you, even then, though he didn't fully understand why at the time. He seemed determined enough about it, regardless." Ethan laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded, in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine, standing in this same room exactly 1 year earlier, when he had been a man who claimed nothing in any ballroom could hold his genuine interest. Everything had changed since that night, not through some dramatic single moment, but through the slow, steady accumulation of honesty, vulnerability, and consistent choice that two people made, again and again, to trust each other, despite every reason the world offered them to remain guarded instead. As the evening progressed toward its natural conclusion, Ethan guided Clara toward the same terrace doors where they had first spoken honestly to each other, all those months earlier, and reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve a small velvet box he had carried carefully throughout the entire evening, waiting for exactly this moment. "I know we've only had a year together," he said, his usual composure giving way entirely to something raw and sincere. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about wanting to build a future with you, Clara. Not because it's convenient, not because anyone expects it, but because you're the only person who has ever made me feel like the man I actually am, rather than the man everyone else needed me to be." Clara felt tears gathering as she looked at him, understanding fully now how far they had both traveled since that first night, when neither of them had believed anything genuine could grow between two people from such different worlds. "Yes," she said softly, before he had even finished asking the question properly, both of them laughing through unexpected tears at her eagerness. Outside the ballroom windows, the same city lights glittered against the night sky that had witnessed their very first, unlikely encounter, and somewhere within the grand room behind them, the string quartet continued playing, unaware that the quiet corner near the terrace doors had just become the setting for the happiest moment either Clara or Ethan had ever known. What had begun as an ordinary evening for a man who claimed nothing could hold his attention had become, in the end, the story of exactly how much one unexpected departure could change everything that followed.